And we are back reviewing all of the best Commander cards in the black color from the upcoming set Duskmourn House of Horror, releasing on September 27th, 2024. My name is Nathan, you're watching the Salty Productions YouTube channel. Today we have a lot to get through. Black by far has the most amount of playable Commander cards from Duskmourn, which I suppose makes sense and is appropriate because horror is basically Black's shtick. But before we get into those card discussions, if you enjoy this content, leave a like on the video and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I've already recorded the white and blue videos, and I still have to record the red, green, and multicolored videos, and red will include artifacts and lands in that as well. So by subscribing, you can be sure to stay tuned for all of that. First up, we have Polluted Cistern, which is the only effect that I'm really primarily interested in this particular effect, although the modality of Dim Oubliette is quite nice. So the way that rooms work in Duskmourn is that when you cast a room, you pay the mana cost of one side of the room, and it will be unlocked, and you get the effect of that. And once it's on the battlefield, you can then, at sorcery speed, pay for the other half of the room to unlock it, to get that effect as well. If you reanimate the rooms, you get neither rooms unlocked, and you're going to have to pay for both sides or one of the sides to get the effects. But you cannot reanimate rooms. It's not a good strategy because they come back basically empty. And then on the stack, the room has the CMC of whichever room you are unlocking. And then if the card is anywhere else, I believe it is the combined mana cost of both of those in case you want to do any sort of enchantment mana value shenanigans. So Polluted Cistern is what we're primarily looking at here. For 2 mana, it says whenever one or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, each opponent loses 1 life for each card type among those cards. So another sort of delirium effect here, caring about the number of types of cards in our deck. And then Dim Oubliette is somewhat playable. It's 5 mana for a mill 3 cards and then reanimate a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield effect, which can be nice, I suppose, when you're self-milling and doing things like that. It is nice to have the option to reanimate if you have a big bomb in your graveyard, but 5 mana is a little bit below rate, so that's not primarily why I would be looking to play this card. It's sort of like a miniature Sir Conrad the Grim. Of course, I think Sir Conrad is much better because he triggers on whenever creature cards leave your graveyard in addition to actually entering your graveyard, and it also will grab the triggers off of anything leaving the battlefield instead of just going into your graveyard from your library. But Polluted Cistern does a nice miniature impression of Sir Conrad the Grim, and I will note as well, you want to be milling one little instance at a time instead of milling a bunch, because if you mill, let's say, 10 cards into your graveyard, but they're all creatures, for example, then Polluted Cistern will only actually ping your opponents for 1 because there's only 1 card type being milled in that big burst of mill. So you want to be able to mill multiple instances in order to get the most value out of Polluted Cistern, but this can be a good burn spell in those types of self-mill decks. And of course, you probably want to be slotting this into those self-mill and reanimator decks. Raffine is very popular within this archetype, and Old Stick Fingers, I just wanted to grab a nice Golgari example here because it's basically a mill effect right on the commander, so that would be a nice addition into those decks. And then the natural follow-up would be to pay for the Dim Oubliette. Once you have your big bomb in your graveyard, it can reanimate all of those great bombs. Next, we have Into the Pit. 3 mana enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast spells from the top of your library by sacrificing a non-land permanent in addition to paying their other costs, which is pretty interesting. The only other effects we've seen in mono black would be your Bolas's Citadel type of effects, and if you happen to be in like an artifact style of deck, then Mystic Forge would be a similar deck, although it's not really the same effect necessarily. But Into the Pit is great source of card advantage if you are able to consistently sack things to turn it on. And so of course this will go into your aristocrats decks where you want to be sacking various things off of your board. So Egra Eater Val is a recent commander from Bloomborough, which basically is a Golgari aristocrats deck, and Sherry Shizo's Caretaker. My buddy Jordan has a deck that utilizes Sherry at the helm, and the play pattern is basically to sack all of the things on your board board every turn, and then Cherie will bring them back at the end of each end step. And so theoretically in these decks, you are turning on into the pit every time because you're going to be sacrificing something. Also notably, this will work with treasures. So if you are in any sort of treasure decks, you can immediately start turning on into the pit by paying for things with your treasure mana, which is pretty great as well. And I think that this is going to be a great source of card advantage in those decks. Now, obviously, it's not going to be drawing you cards, but you can cast, a few spells off the top of your deck. I will note, though, it does not say play lands, so you do run into the Bolas Citadel sort of blockade, where once you actually hit that land and you've already played your land drop, then you're going to end the rest of the turn with this effect. Unfortunately, there's not a way around that unless you play like a Sensei's Divining Top or something like that to get around it. Then we have Deluge of Doom, 3 mana sorcery. All creatures get -X until end of turn, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, which is basically a Toxic Deluge impression for those Delirium types of decks. We've seen Terror Tide at 4 mana, say all creatures get -X until end of turn, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So you probably are also already playing Terror Tide as well. So this is just a nice way to get around indestructible effects, but I think this is basically a free Toxic Deluge, and by free I mean you don't have to pay the life to get to the -X effect. The only problem I would see is this won't actually get you up to like the ridiculous, big creatures like your 10/10s or your 12/12s, because even with Toxic Deluge, sometimes you are willing to pay that 12 life just to get all of the creatures off of the board, but I don't think Deluge of Doom can get you quite there if you're running into super tall creatures like against like Eldrazi decks or something like that. So just a forewarning, I think this might be still perhaps number 2 in a Delirium style deck behind Toxic Deluge. So the decks that might want this would be your Delirium types of decks. So Babala Saga has always been a classic, and then Winter Cynical Opportunist is a commander that was recently printed in Duskmourn as well as the head of the precon with green and black. Alright, and next we have Sadistic Shell Game, 5 mana sorcery. Starting with the next opponent in turn order, each player chooses a creature you don't control. Destroy the chosen creatures. Now, it should be noted that you start with the next opponent, and then you are the last person to choose the creatures. So if everybody sort of agrees to target the least valuable thing on board in order to brick most of the effect of the spell, you are still able to get at least the thing that you want and then another useless thing, instead of having, if it started with you, everybody would just vote for that same thing in order to basically have this be a 5 mana removal spell. So I would compare this actually to something like a Curtain's Call or Malicious Affliction. I think that these are honestly better effects because they're instant speed. Being sorcery speed in Commander is such a downside that I couldn't realistically play this in a deck that I wanted to be fully optimized at that sort of 3.5 or 4 out of 5 power level, because I just rather run Curtain's Call, which is going to be a 3 mana snipe the 2 best creatures. Notably, Sadistic Shell Game gets around Hexproof and Ward because you are choosing instead of targeting, but the problem with this is that at 5 mana, I'd almost rather just play a board wipe, and we have better effects already in the format. Make an example is going to be another sort of side grade to Sadistic Shell Game for 1 less mana, I might add, where each opponent separates the creatures they control into 2 piles. For each opponent, you choose one of their piles. So you're always going to get the best thing off of your opponent's board. And Swarm Your Massacre is sort of a, could be a one-sided board wipe if you are running specific tribal creatures, but it's just for 5 mana, you have the possibility for a one-sided board wipe with something like a Swarmyard Massacre. Of course, you have to meet the tribal restrictions, but I just don't know if I would pay 5 mana for this. I think this could have been playable at around 4 mana, but I do really like the actual card's ability, the design of it, and how it plays. I love voting cards. I used to have a voting deck way back in the day, and I do actually have a choice tribal deck, which I'll do a deck tech at some point in the future on, on, and I think this would be great in that particular deck. I don't know if I could really recommend this because it's just not, it doesn't do enough if you're the arch enemy at the table, because your opponents can possibly use this to gang up on you. The ceiling, of course, is if somebody else is the arch enemy and you need their 3 best things off of the board, you can talk about this with your opponents and try to sort of negotiate which things they will target or choose, I suppose, if you want to be very technical about it. But the problem is we already have Make an Example, and so I think that I would much rather run Make an Example in a generic deck than Sadistic Shell Game. So, but regardless, I think this would probably go in those voting decks. So Tivit and the Valeyard are both your sort of voting commanders that are popular in the format. But outside of that, I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend this, although I think it is a fun spell to resolve. Next, we have Funeral Room and Awakening Hall, so another room enchantment here. Funeral Room, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and that effect costs 3 mana. And Awakening Hall, 8 mana. When you unlock this door, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, which either side of these are going to be absolutely amazing, whether in a Reanimator deck or an Aristocrats deck. It's sort of like a Bastion of Remembrance combined with a Haunting Voyage, but it doesn't care about creature types. And so there's also Rise of the Dark Realms, which is at 9 mana, but I'd almost rather run Awakening Hall over Rise of the Dark Realms, just because as Commander speeds up, that 9 mana plus is somewhat unachievable if you're not doing heavy ramping in green in particular. But Awakening Hall, I think I would rather play just because my creatures are probably what I most care about anyway, knowing that I have a bunch of bombs in the graveyard. And I think that, you go from probably winning the game to really, really winning the game between Rise of the Dark Realms and Awakening Hall. And I believe Rise of the Dark Realms is like a $15 card, so if cost is a consideration, then maybe take a look at Awakening Hall. I guess I don't know, the set hasn't released yet, but I would imagine that this might be a little bit cheaper than Rise of the Dark Realms, given that it hasn't been reprinted in a long, long time. This is just going to be honestly one of the best cards in the set, just because it goes in almost every black deck, right? Black decks care about sacking their creatures and reanimating their creatures. So this is going to be a slam dunk into your Aristocrats decks. Teysa Karlov, of course, standing in as the sort of most popular one of those. And Yogg is another popular Aristocrats deck as well. But if you wanted to run this in Rafine decks or any Reanimator decks, the Wise Mothman, etc., then definitely run this card. It will serve you very well. Next, we have Valgavoth Terror Eater, a 9 mana 9/9 Elder Demon with flying and lifelink. Ward, sacrifice 3 non-land permanents, which is basically hexproof, unless you have a bunch of artifact tokens and other junk laying around. If a card you didn't control will be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. During your turn, you may play cards exiled with Valgavoth. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its mana value rather than pay its mana cost. Now, if this card is triggering your memory in some way, this is basically a big version of Dauthi Voidwalker. Dauthi Voidwalker has essentially the same text, but you can only use it once, because with Dauthi Voidwalker, you tap it and sack it, choose an exile card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. So Valgavoth sits on the battlefield, sticks around, accumulating value, and basically just draws you cards equal to whatever your opponents are putting in their graveyards, which include all instants and sorceries, and then any creatures that go into the graveyard. So the question is, does Valgavoth make it into playable cards at the top end, because it doesn't necessarily win you the game upon entering the battlefield? It is a good card advantage spell, I will say, and I think if it didn't have lifelink, it would be far less playable than it currently is, because it does sort of semi-refund you on the life that you have to pay to cast those spells. But if we take a look at sort of similar cards that do similar things, I think Gix Yawgmoth Praetor might actually just be a better effect that is sort of similar. Its activated ability, you can pay 7 and discard X cards, so you actually strategically fill your graveyard, and it says exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. You may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs, so you don't even have to pay the life for it, and it will actually draw you cards, because it says whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. So I just don't know know if Valgavoth is worth running even in self-mill and reanimator decks as a top end, because you would specifically want to care about having a card advantage engine be in your top end reanimation targets, and you would want to care about the fact that it's an Elder Demon perhaps. So I was thinking, like, even in Wise Mothman or Turgid God of Fright, Turgid of course being an example where if you have Valgavoth on the battlefield, you are probably more likely to be able to trigger those death triggers to get creature cards exiled with Valgavoth with sack effects that you'll probably be running alongside Turgid. Turgid actually might be a little bit of a nombo now that I think about it more, because if Turgid is on the battlefield, then you'll get sacrifice permanents back on the battlefield immediately with Turgid. Why would I play this over just Turgid in the 99, right? Like, why wouldn't we reanimate Turgid and then with a sack effect we would just get the creatures immediately instead of having to play them? I realize that I'm undervaluing the 9/9 flying lifelink body, and I think that that is actually very nice, and the fact that it has basically hexproof as well, but it's just, it doesn't immediately win you the game the turn it comes down, which is why I sort of question this. If it was 7 mana, I think it would be a very good card and a good chase card out of the set, but 9 mana is so hard to hit, to be hard cast, and even when you're reanimating it, there's just better things to be reanimating in my personal opinion. Like, we got the new Ulamog, which essentially once that swings, it basically says target opponent loses the game because you just annihilate them for so many triggers. I'm not sold on Valgavoth being the best top end to include in a self-mill and reanimator deck, such as the Wise Mothman, for example. Next, we have Unholy Annex and Ritual Chamber. Unholy Annex is what I'm paying attention to for this particular card. For 3 mana, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card. If you control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Otherwise, you lose 2 life. And I think this will immediately replace any sort of card advantage engines in your demon decks. So Phyrexian Arena is a similar effect that will draw you a card only at the beginning of your upkeep, and you lose 1 life instead of gaining 2 life with Unholy Annex. Of course, you have to be in a demon deck, but Promise of Power. So if we look at Ritual Chamber, basically it's just a worse version of Promise of Power, because it's going to cost us 5 mana to get a 6/6 black demon creature token with flying, and I don't think we would really hard cast that, because just 5 mana for a generic 6/6 flyer is just not that good in 2024 Commander, and Promise of Power can actually generate us an even bigger demon, or allow us the option to draw 5 cards and lose 5. So you probably wouldn't be playing this for Ritual Chamber because there are better options out there, but Unholy Annex I do really like in demon decks, and I would still run this alongside Black Market Connections, because you can still be generating a lot of mana. Demons tend to be very intensive in the higher end of the CMCs, so I'd still run Black Market Connections and lose the life to generate the treasure, but then you would want to run this in place of any other card draw engines like Phyrexian Arena to help gain you some life. And then, so also I just wanted to actually mention too, outside of demon decks, would you run this by paying 2 life? And honestly, I think I might if I wanted a similar Black Market Connections type of effect. I will say 2 life for every card does add up over the course of a game, and I believe it is forced because it doesn't say you may, so you're going to be losing 2 life every turn anyway. But if you were in like a Carrick deck, for example, that's something that might be gaining you life constantly throughout the course of the game. This might actually be playable just outside of a demon deck. So the commanders here, I have Be'lakor is sort of the poster boy for demon decks. Of course, Rakdos the Showstopper, also a very powerful Rakdos demon commander. I actually use Abaddon the Despoiler. Basically, the play pattern is you swing in with a flyer, you deal 6 damage from a 6/6 demon, and then all of a sudden you can cast spells with CMC 6 or less with Cascade for the rest of your turn to generate a bunch of mana and card advantage, which I noticed that demon decks tended to want just because they are so top end heavy. Next, we have Vile Mutilator, 7 mana 6/5 demon. As an initial cost to cast a spell, sack a creature or enchantment. It has flying and trample, and when it enters, each opponent sacks a non-token enchantment, then sacrifices a non-token creature, which I do really like that we get some incidental enchantment hate. And we've seen this before. I think of Duskmourn in particular. Same mana cost, says an additional cost to cast a spell, sack a creature, discard a card, or pay 4 life. And then when it ETBs, each opponent sacks a creature, discards a card, and loses 4 life. life. And Gourmand is sort of another example here, but I would run Vile Mutilator alongside any deck that already wants to play Duskmangler that can get around the additional cost to cast a spell, so basically reanimating it out of your graveyard. This is a slam dunk in Arami of the Dead Tide, forcing each opponent to sack 3 non-token creatures and 3 non-token enchantments. Oh my god, this is so backbreaking. Man, every time I've had a Duskmangler be reanimated with Arami, it's just like, geez Louise, like, you guys, I feel kind of bad just because it just nukes opponents so hard. And of course, Old Stick Finger is another stand-in here for just more reanimator commanders that would want to be reanimating this out of the graveyard. And I really like, personally, like the way that I build decks is that my reanimation targets and top end tend to have a lot of removal stapled to them, because I like to have sort of, I guess you could call it card advantage, but also removal just stapled on my top end, because by the time you actually are ready to reanimate things out of your graveyard, your opponents probably have something scary on board, and so I like being able to take out whatever scary things that I need taking out, while then presenting myself, you know, as the dominant force on board to hopefully close out the game from there. So Vile Mutilator, great in self-mill and reanimator decks. And next we have one of my personal least favorite cards from the set, Doomsday Excruciator. 6 black pips, a total of 6 mana for a 6/6 flyer demon. When it enters, if it was cast, thank God they put that on it, each player exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of their library face down, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card. This, to me, has game invalidation vibes, such as Insurrection. Insurrection used to be one of my favorite cards to play in decks. It was just an auto-include in every red deck. Didn't even care that it costs 8 mana, because it has won me probably the most amount of games out of any red card that I've ever played. But the problem with Insurrection is that it basically invalidates all of the previous game state before it, where you could do literally nothing all game, cast Insurrection, and then win the game from there. It only cares about, I suppose, specifically the cards that you've drawn before it has hit the field, and hopefully you have no max hand size, because you probably want to be in a position where you have the most amount of cards out of anybody. So likely with this card you'd be running like a Reliquary Tower or some sort of no max hand size effect, because it basically just says, okay everybody, we are no longer playing Magic with our decks of 100 cards. We are now playing Magic with 6 cards and whatever cards you have in your hand. The game's about to be over in a turn. Have fun. And that to me is just not the gameplay experience that I'm looking for. It's sort of like when a leveler gets donated to you from whatever the Dimir commander is that donates bad permanents to you, which I will put up on the screen here. It's such a feel bad when it comes down and basically just says target opponent loses the game. And I feel like this card basically says each of your opponents loses the game. And yes, it sort of is denying you the effect here by saying at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card to push you towards a game loss, but you know that this is going to be run in cards that run Thassa's Oracle, Laboratory Maniac, and all of the other BS you win the game cards that I personally am not a fan of. I absolutely hate cards that just say you win the game on it, you know, no matter how unlikely it is that you can meet this condition to jump through the hoop to win the game. You know that with all of the cards we have in Magic's history at our disposal, people are going to break these in half to make that very easy. And so personally, it is my opinion that Doomsday Excruciator should not be run at casual tables and should only be run in decks that are already playing Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, which would be either your 9 or 10 out of 10 power level, so either CEDH or Fringe CEDH, because this just completely invalidates anything that was taking place before it, and I absolutely hate Doomsday Excruciator. All right, let's move on from this excruciating card and move to Overlord of the Balemark, which is a 5-mana 5/5 Avatar Horror enchantment creature, but most of the time it's going to be cast for its impending cost. For 2 mana, it says if you cast a spell for its impending cost, it enters with 5 time counters on it and isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So then we have whenever Overlord of the Balemark enters or attacks, mill 4 cards, that you may return a non-avatar creature card or planeswalker planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. I think that this card is a great vegetable card in Self-Mill and Reanimator decks where you want to be putting cards into your graveyard. It's very similar actually to Undead Butler, which says when it ETBs, mill 3 cards, and then when it dies you may exile it, and when you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it refunds that card. Obviously, if you're in a zombie deck, you're going to be playing Undead Butler over Overlord of the Balemark, but I think it's still just a nice vegetable card for 2 mana to be able to mill 4 and then return a non-avatar creature card or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand is going to be just a great effect overall to play on turn 2. I mean, self-mill decks generally don't want to be ramping on turns 2 or 3. You generally want to be self-milling, and so to see this in your hand in the early game or late game is going to be absolutely excellent, and so it's just going to be a very flexible card no matter which point in the game you're at. And then I also included Dire Sight here, which is a recent printing from Bloomborough. It's going to allow you for 3 mana to surveil 2, then draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. So it doesn't, it will draw you 1 more card for 1 more mana, but with Overlord you do get 2 additional cards into your graveyard. So if you care about putting more cards in your graveyard, then I'd probably stick with the Overlord. And the best fit for this card, I think, is in Onyxia decks. Of course, being an enchantment, Onyxia can reanimate it. And then I've also got another sort of stand-in here for self-mill and reanimator decks, the Necrobloom, but you could pick any sort of self-mill deck, Rafine, the Wise Mothman, Captain Ningathrod, anything, you know, that is going to utilize the graveyards and where you want to be putting cards in there. So that is Overlord of the Balemark. I think this is the most playable of the Overlords. I think the rest of the Overlords are just a little bit below rate each on the impending cost, but I would happily pay 2 mana to mill 4 and then return a creature card to my hand. And next we have Grievous Wound, and this is a 5-mana enchantment aura, not a curse, by the way. Enchanted player can't gain life. When an enchanted player is dealt damage, they lose half their life, rounded up. Don't play this card. This card is so unbelievably mean and leads to such feel-bads. Now, if your table is down for that, great. To be able to swing with a bunch of tokens and basically annihilate one player, I don't necessarily like that play pattern. I think this card is incredibly unfun at most casual tables, and I would heavily encourage that you just don't play this because A, you're going to piss people off, but B, you're going to take 1 player out of the game for 5 mana, and I don't necessarily want to be doing that. I'd rather play cards that allow me to take down my opponents all at once so that you don't have one person that is just sitting there twiddling their thumbs for 45 minutes while everybody else finishes their game. And next we have Meathook Massacre II, Electric Boogaloo. It's XX and 4 black pips. For a legendary enchantment, when it enters, each player sacrifices X creatures. Whenever a creature you control dies, you may pay 3 life. If you do, return that card under your control with a finality counter on it. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, they may pay 3 life. If they don't, return that card under your control with a finality counter on it. This card, I will say, is pretty difficult to evaluate in terms of imagining the scenarios where you would be generating a lot of value, because you could either care about sacking all of your board at once, or maybe a couple of creatures on your board to get new ETBs or die triggers by paying the 3 life. But I think that in most situations, if you're playing this in an Aristocrats deck, paying 3 life on each sacrifice effect is going to be too much life over the long term, and so I think I settled on this being more valuable by getting your opponents to face the choice of either paying 3 life or having their creatures come back onto the field under your control. So I think you'd probably mostly be seeing this in decks that want your opponent's creatures to die, so something like a Turgid God of Fright deck or a Shalab Child of Ungoliant deck. Turgid maybe a bad example here, because if an opponent would sacrifice a creature with Turgid, you would immediately get it. So maybe Meathook Massacre would be sort of like a backup Turgid effect, or like a miniature Turgid effect. But in something like Shalab, where you have creatures dying all the time, then that forces your opponents to face that difficult decision of whether they want to pay the 3 life. I think it might be also interesting in any sort of like Rakdos sacrifice deck, because with Rakdos, they tend to burn their opponents out pretty quickly, and then the life choice would be pretty difficult, and feeds you a lot of value. Either way, I think that Meathook Massacre II is going to be delivering a lot of value, but you have to pair it with mass destruction effects, in my personal opinion, for this to be very good. So it's sort of like, I think the play pattern would be, if you have your Bastion of Remembrance out on the field and then you cast a Damnation, you then get best of both worlds, because you're getting the life refund effect off of Bastion of Remembrance to sort of offset any life that you would pay towards the Meathook trigger for your own creatures, but then your opponents will face that choice a bunch of times to either lose the life or return that card on a battlefield under your control with a finality counter. And I think honestly the best way to view this would probably be as a burn spell, if I'm being completely honest, because I would say, you know, most of the time your opponents are going to be paying the 3 life to prevent you from getting the extra value from their creatures going on the battlefield under your control. And it's gravy if they actually allow you to get their creatures, because then you could maybe, you know, use them to sacrifice for further death triggers and so forth off of your sack outlets. So I think you just need to pair this up with mass destroy effects or something like that in order to get the most amount of value. And it's interesting because I think in the late game you probably would pay, I don't know, between 8 to 10 mana into this if you have a lot of mana laying around. So I think it'll serve you well, especially in the late game. It's just, I don't know if it's really worth it for 4 mana to play Meathook Massacre II. If it's basically a do nothing enchantment the turn it comes down if you're paying it for 4. So definitely an interesting card. I think it's one of the most interesting cards we've seen in black from Duskmourn. Very hard to evaluate, but I think I've settled on this being a good card in the right deck. Perhaps not in a vacuum, but most black decks tend to be focused around reanimation and so forth, and mass destroy via sacrifice effects and things like that. So I think that this will serve itself pretty well in I suppose most black decks. And next we have Unstoppable Slasher, a 3-mana 2/3 zombie assassin, which I do like the fact that this is a zombie because we can slot it into our Willhelt decks. It has Death Touch. Whenever Unstoppable Slasher deals combat damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up, I might add, rounded up. Whenever Unstoppable Slasher dies, if it had no counters on it, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with 2 stun counters on it, which is a very cool horror movie type of effect where it will just simply keep on coming back. Now, we have seen this in the past, not as good, mind you, but in Commander 2014, the black deck, which was helmed, I believe, by an Obnixilis Planeswalker, had Raving Dead in it, which is a 5-mana 2/6 Death Touch zombie. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose an opponent at random. Raving Dead attacks that player this combat if able, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half of his or her life rounded down. And Vertus of the Veiled is a better version of this effect because you could just choose who you attack, and it also has the Death Touch, but it's a 1/1. So Unstoppable Slasher, very cool card. I really like the flavor of this card, and I think it's really funny in the zombie decks that are going to give their zombies like flying or something crazy, or maybe there's like a double strike or extra combat effect if you're running this in like a Rakdos deck. I think it's just very, very cool flavor wise, and of course this combos with your Wound Reflection and Bloodletter of Aclazotz to basically just take somebody out of the game immediately. And I know we were just talking about how you shouldn't run Grievous Wounds because it's such a feel bad, but at least with this, you have a 2-card combo essentially to take one opponent out of the game for 9 between, let's see, 7 and 9 mana, and 2 cards to get that effect instead of just having somebody be essentially the blood bag for the table. But I think Unstoppable Slasher, very cool card, and I love that it comes back. And if you even put this in your Willhelt decks, you can sack the Unstoppable Slasher and then it will come back, so you get the trigger off of Willhelt to draw a card, and it will come back tapped, and once you let those stun counters be removed from the creature, then we can sack it again and do the same thing. So there's a little bit more versatility with sacrificing the Unstoppable Slasher as well. And I have Kami's Obscure Oculus here because it can give a target attacking creature unblockable, and it can give another attacking creature with lesser power double strike. So both of those keywords are important, or I suppose effects you could say are important for the Unstoppable Slasher. So very cool synergies with a Kami's Obscura Oculus deck as well. And next we have Popular Egotist, 3 mana 3/2 human rogue. You can pay 2 and sack another creature or enchantment. Popular Egotist gains indestructible until end of turn, and you tap it. But most importantly, whenever you sack a permanent, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Now this sounds familiar. This is basically a Nadier's Nightblade, 3 mana 1/3. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So Popular Egotist only targets 1 opponent, and Mirkwood Bat's similar effect here. Each opponent loses 1 life, but it doesn't have the life gain effect. I think Popular Egotist is going to go right into those artifact and just junk sacking decks, like a Prosper deck that's going to be sacking a lot of treasures. Tivit's going to be sacking a lot of treasures and clues, and so this is going to be yet another tool in the repertoire for these decks to actually close out the game by sacking all of their treasures in 1 turn. Next we have Come Back Wrong, 3 mana sorcery, destroy target creature. If a creature card is put into a graveyard this way, return it to the battlefield under your control, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, which is kind of like a mini Turgid effect, kinda sorta. I don't think we've really seen this as an effect in black before, which is why I have Fairy Artisans, because Fairy Artisans allow you to basically get all of your opponent's ETBs from creatures by creating a token that's a copy of a creature anytime a non-token creature enters. Come Back Wrong is going to be a good removal spell where you get those nice ETBs or leave the battlefield triggers. So if you are running this in like a Turgid deck or something, or again, Turgid is probably a bad example because I suppose Turgid would just return the creature to your side anyway. But imagine this, right? Imagine you actually use this on your own creature, right? If you have a Stitcher Supplier, or let's say you're in, even better, a poison deck with a Gulping Scrap Trap. What you do is you cast this on the Gulping Scrap Trap. You've already gotten the 1 ETB off of it entering. Now it will leave the battlefield proliferating again, so now we're up to 2 proliferates from Gulping Scrap Trap. Then it will come back and then leave again for a total of 4 proliferates, which could possibly end the game in a poison deck. We got him, ladies and gentlemen. So Come Back Wrong, kind of an interesting card. It's not instant speed, which are marks against it, but if you happen to be in like an ETB heavy meta where your friend plays a lot of Yarok or something like that, then you could consider this in those decks. And of course, if you care about death triggers in your Aristocrats decks, Teysa Karlov or Marin of Clan Neltoth, then you can then sacrifice the creature that then came back onto the battlefield under your control before you actually get that end step trigger, so you can get incremental value from your sack outlets as well. So that's kind of nice. And next we have Ancient Cellarspawn, 3 mana 3/3 enchantment creature horror. Each spell you cast that's a demon, horror, or nightmare costs 1 less to cast, which is great for those tribal decks. And whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast it was less than its mana value, target opponent loses life equal to the difference. So I think this is just an insta-slam in those tribal decks. Captain Engithrod, a very popular horror tribal commander. Be'lakor or Abaddon, for example, great demon tribal commanders. I think this is an insta-slam into those decks. And then it has some interesting synergy as well. Bolas' Citadel, very popular in the EDH format, and Ancient Cellarspawn will ping opponents equal to the basically the spell's mana value of spells you cast with Bolas' Citadel, because you're going to be paying life instead of their mana cost. So Ancient Cellarspawn can whip out some crazy damage there. And of course, Abaddon is giving spells you cast Cascade, assuming you have dealt some damage this turn. So that's going to be a good synergy piece as well there. And then we also have, it can close out the game if you happen to have infinite spell cast combos that are generating free spells. So if you have an Isochron Scepter with a dramatic reversal underneath it, you can then basically copy and cast spells that for 0 mana cost, because you're actually paying the mana with Isochron Scepter's ability and not actually casting the card. And with Ancient Cellarspawn on the battlefield, that will result in infinite damage to each of your opponents, which is somewhat neat if you're into infinite combos. Next, we have Demonic Counsel, 2 mana sorcery. Search your library for a demon card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Then Delirium if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. Instead, search your library for any card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. This is so good in Demon decks, and I'm so happy we have more Demon support. Of course, this is a strict downgrade from Demonic Tutor, but Demonic Tutor is absolutely broken in Commander, and I believe this is just one of the best cards that's ever been printed in black. 2 mana is way undercosted for what it should be for an unconditional tutor, but I do like that now we can say, okay, well, this is not as powerful as a Demonic Tutor because we're running it in a Demon deck, and this was printed for Demon decks, so we get a little bit of extra power there. And then Diabolic Intent, similar mana cost, but you have to sack a creature to search up a card as well. And then if you care about Delirium, so if you're in like a Baba Lasada deck, for example, then it's also another unconditional Demonic Tutor. Personally, I don't run many of these, but because it is very flavorful for Demon decks, I will be including it into my Abaddon Demon Tribal deck. And with that, I believe that takes us to our honorable mentions, which are going to be cards that didn't quite make the cut. I don't think they'll quite move the needle in Commander, but may have certain niche use cases that I wanted to show you guys anyway. So we have Demonic Covenant, 6-mana Kindred Enchantment Demon. Whenever one or more demons you control attack a player, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Then at the beginning of your end step, create a 5/5 black demon creature token with flying. Then mill 2 cards. If 2 cards that share all their card types were milled this way, sacrifice Demonic Covenant. Now, I did some quick math on the current deck list for my Abaddon Demon Tribal deck, and I currently have a 25% chance of meeting the criteria where the 2 card types will be shared. I didn't look at like multiple card types, so like artifact creatures or anything like that. I just took creature, instant, sorcery, enchantment, and then sort of did the math based on that. So that resulted in a 25% chance for this to basically sacrifice itself immediately on the first trigger, which isn't great, which is why I think this is on the honorable mentions list. But I believe if you tick it up to like half of your deck is creatures, then that ticks up to about 50% chance for this to be sacrificed on the first end step. So even if you draw 3 cards off of this, lose 3 life, and then make a 5/5 black demon card, then mill 2 cards, I just think it's too risky to have this be sacrificed the first turn it comes down when you're paying 6 mana. So kind of an interesting card in demon decks. I mean, it is interesting, it's just not that good in my personal opinion. Unless you have anything that cares about the specific demon like creature type that somehow we can reduce the cost or something like that. The problem is that we already have the 6 CMC be crowded in demon decks. I mean, this is competing with actual demons. Burning Room Demon will generate you card advantage. Demon Lord Belzenlock will generate you card advantage from being also at 6 mana and also being demon creatures that can be reanimated. So I just don't think this quite makes the cut in those demon decks, although it is nice to see that demon support is being printed. It's just too risky to be sacrificed immediately. It does make a demon the turn it comes down, so maybe I will experiment with this in my demon deck for a little bit. And I will say that the 3 card draw per turn is pretty interesting, but I don't think it's super good, but it is definitely interesting enough where I will be testing this card out in my Demon Tribal deck. Next, and then Be'lakor is the very popular Demon Commander that you might see this in. And then next we have Suspended Sentence, which is instant, destroy target creature an opponent controls. That player loses 3 life, exile Suspended Sentence with 3 time counters on it. And then you can suspend this for 3 for paying only 2 mana. I think this is really interesting in Obika Splitter of Seconds decks, and that's pretty much about it, so that with Obika you can accelerate these suspend counters being removed. Then we have Enduring Tenacity, 4 mana, 4/3 enchantment creature, Snake Glimmer. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. And when it dies, if it was a creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control as an enchantment. This is a slightly worse version of Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose, although it has a little bit more survivability because of it returning as an enchantment. And if you care about enchantments, I suppose you could consider this for your decks to trigger all of your enchantment synergies. I just think it's 1 mana too much considering we already have Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose, and so in a vacuum, I would not run this over Vito. Then we have Sporogenic Infection, 2 mana enchantment aura, enchant creature. When it enters, target player sacrifices a creature other than enchanted creature creature, but then when enchanted creature is dealt damage, destroy it. First of all, cool flavor on this, given that it's supposed to be like a disease type of effect. I think that Wizards could probably print more disease type of effects in the future where some creature becomes infected and then another creature dies as a result. I think that's really cool flavor. I think you would probably run this initially, I thought, in Tergrid decks, but this is great in actually the new Valgavoth deck, so Group Slug, where we can be dealing 1 damage to all of our opponent's creatures with like a Pestilence type of effect to immediately be able to destroy that creature. So I think that this is a decent removal spell if you're already running Pestilence types of effects in your deck. So definitely consideration there. Then we have Final Vengeance, which is a 1-mana sorcery. As initial cost to cast a spell, sack a creature or enchantment, exile target creature. So a nice exile effect on a sorcery speed, which is kind of the biggest downside here. We have seen this before with Eaten Alive, where you can sack a creature or just pay additional mana to exile target creature or planeswalker. But I just wanted to mention this in case you are already running Eaten Alive to get around any sort of indestructible effects. We have another 1-mana exile target creature effect in mono black now, which is kind of cool. And then next we have our top 3 black cards. So the 3 best black cards that personally I think are the best from this entire set, and you'll probably see the most amount of play. And with a drum roll, please, we have Awakening Hall, Doomsday Excruciator, and a Popular Egotist. And then I also have Meathook Massacre II here as a big question mark because I am very curious to see how this card will play out. So Funeral Room and Awakening Hall are just going to be great in any Aristocrats and Self-Mill and Reanimator decks, and you're going to be seeing this card the most, I think, out of this entire set, not only in black, but perhaps just in the set overall, just because this goes in so many black decks that have the relevant effects that you want on the card. Doomsday Excruciator is incredibly powerful for what it does. It basically says we're going to end the game for 6 mana and there's nothing you can do about it unless you counter it on the way down, which I think is super unfun, or if you have some sort of stifle effect, I suppose you'd want to run it. But I absolutely hate this card, and even though I must admit that it is very powerful, I just absolutely hate this card with a burning passion. Popular Egotist, I think you're going to see a lot of in your artifact sacrifice decks, so your Tivit and Prosper decks are going to be running a lot of treasures. This is going to be right alongside Mirkwood Bats and Nightier's Nightblade within those decks, and so you're going to see a lot of Popular Egotist, and also because it can protect itself with that sacrifice effect. All right, with that, that is the best black cards from Duskmourn House of Horrors Commander video. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Once again, I will be coming out with the red, green, and the multicolored videos right after this. I'm making these as fast as I can, editing them and getting them uploaded for you guys. And then if you also are interested in the other white and blue videos, I have those already posted. You can check those out. Links down in the description below. With that, you've been watching Salty Productions YouTube channel. Hopefully we will see you all in the next one.